Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudele. Hello, everyone, and welcome to JFK the Enduring Secret YouTube channel. Well, this has been a long time coming, and this is our very first episode. For those of you who are already listeners of our popular podcast, JFK the Enduring Secret, well, now we have an exciting set of new shows that cover materials and stories that you won't find on the podcast itself. Today is inaugural episode number 1, and it's an amazing one. Today, we visit with some of the authors of a brand new book out entitled Chokeholds, a new book on the JFK assassination. It's not often that you are able to bring together 5 very learned individuals and have them be in a position to collaborate all together on a single book about the assassination. And that is exactly what happened with Chokeholds. The author group is led by James DiEugenio. And for those of you who follow the assassination more closely than others, you'll know Jim's name. He is one of the leading researchers on the subject. He's joined in this endeavor by Paul Bleau, Matt Crumpton, Andrew Iler, and Mark Adamczyk. And before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief biographical summary for each of our guests. Let's start with James DiEugenio. Mr. DiEugenio has an M.A. in history from California State University, Northridge. He is a retired teacher who has written or co-edited 4 books on the assassination of the 60s: Destiny Betrayed, The Assassinations, The JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, and finally, JFK Revisited. The last volume is the companion piece to Oliver Stone's 2 recent documentaries on the Kennedy assassination: JFK Revisited, Through the Looking Glass, and JFK Destiny Betrayed. Jim wrote the screenplays for both of those films. He has lectured widely and made many appearances on many broadcast programs about the subject. He is the editor and publisher of the online journal KennedysandKing.com, which features articles, news stories, and critiques of works about the 4 major assassinations of the 60s: JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, and RFK. Next, we turn to Paul Bleau. Paul holds an MBA from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. With over 25 years' experience as a strategic planner on national accounts, Paul eventually took ownership of and presided over Bleau Marketing Communications. He co-founded Harmonia in 2006, which has grown to become a leading commemorative services provider in the Quebec market. Paul has also sat on many boards. He now is in his 18th year as a teacher in the P.W. Sims business program at Champlain St. Lawrence College. Presently a Kappa member, he has a long track record of research and writing about the JFK assassination, which includes appearing in Oliver Stone's documentary, JFK Revisited, Through the Looking Glass, writing numerous articles for KennedysandKing.com, and speaking regularly as a guest on Black Op Radio and on other podcasts. Next, we'll turn to Andrew Iler. Andrew is an Ontario-based lawyer practicing in the areas of corporate law, commercial, and administrative law, having served or chaired provincial and federal governmental tribunals, and having appeared as counsel at the Federal Court, Ontario Court of Appeal, Ontario Superior Court, and numerous federal and provincial tribunals. Over the last several years, Andrew has developed a comprehensive base of knowledge in and around the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992 and legal aspects of the official investigations into the assassination of President Kennedy. Unable to join us today are the other 2 authors, Mark Adamczyk and Matt Crumpton. Matt is also a lawyer, and so is Mark, and I've had the opportunity to do episodes or shows with both these gentlemen, and they're fine folks. We're sorry they were unable to make it today, but we'll hear more from both of them very soon on other episodes. Today, we get a chance to talk with these authors about their new book. So, without further ado, let's proceed directly to this interview. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. And thanks for being on the show today. I'm just so excited about having every one of you on. And this is really kind of an important event in the life of JFK, the Enduring Secret, because we don't have anything yet on the YouTube channel. So you actually are going to be the inaugural show. And oh, what a show it's going to be. Look who I have on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. And Jim's being quiet, but I have to tell you, maybe because I'm older, I can say this. He's the granddaddy of us all in terms of JFK yes. Research and recognition and so on and so forth. And just really happy to have you on. I mean, you're such a recognizable name. You all are actually, but certainly Jim, because of so much of what you've done that's been in the foresight of the public. And
thank
Andrew,
you, Jeff.
You're welcome. I'm thrilled. Andrew, I got to meet Andrew a while back before I've gotten to meet the both of you. And Andrew, there's a few people who obviously know more about the JFK Records Act than anybody on the face of the earth. And I'd put Andrew in that category. Obviously, just an amazing resource for all of us. And I know you know a lot more about other aspects of the case other than just the Records Act issues. But this is so front and center right now in the middle of all this that, we're going to get you on another show pretty soon to talk about that. We've had you on one before with Mark Adamczyk. And I'm sorry, Mark and your other co-author, Matt Crumpton, were not able to be on. Matt and I are friends as well. I'm going to be on one of his shows Sunday, so we'll get a chance to see him. But I know schedules precluded that, but well represented here. So
excellent, Jeff. I got to say, it's been fun watching your show grow over the last few years. I jumped on listening to it when it first started, and it's amazing how many great episodes you've had. So it's been a pleasure getting to know you and watching your show really succeed out there in the wider audience.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, it's really I will say it's really taking off. It took 3 years. It's 3 years old now, and it was a steady rise until just before the 60th anniversary, and all of a sudden, right around the 60th, right before the 60th, we happened to actually be doing some Secret Service episodes. We didn't get to the Secret Service aspect of this until then. So it was good timing with the Paul Landis news and so on and so forth. And we're actually finishing that aspect of it up now. There's 20 or so episodes out there, and I was fatigued, but I think we're going to do a couple more on that. So yeah, and we have as much download volume in the last 6 months as we did in the first 2.5 years, if you can believe it.
So, one of the things about the book, the JFK Assassination Chokeholds, that I really like and appreciate is that I think it's the first book that actually addresses what Joe Biden did with his, I think it was in June of 2023. He essentially lowered the boom on the JFK Records Collection Act. And Andrew wrote that part of the book. And I don't think it's in any other book at least that I've seen so far. Okay. But I think it's very, very important. Okay. What Andrew essentially outlined is that what Biden did actually went a step beyond what Trump did. Okay. And he explains, the how and why of how that happened and why. And that's one of the last parts of the book. What the outline of the book is, it essentially and that, by the way, that one is in the obstruction chapter, which is the last chapter before the conclusion. Okay. Andrew and Paul wrote that, and then I wrote the conclusion. All right. But what they did is they outlined, and I think this is very persuasive. Okay, 60. If the JFK case was as simple as the Warren Commission says it was, if Oswald just went ahead and took three magic shots, okay, and by the way, did you notice I said three magic shots?
Yeah.
Because it's not just, and this is, let me divert just a minute. I actually wanted Oliver to put this in the movie, okay? But he edited it out of the script that I submitted to him. It's not one magic bullet. Everybody knows what the one magic bullet is. It's actually three magic bullets, okay? Because, let me explain, I'll try and make this as brief as I can. On the so-called missing shot, that missed not only did it miss the car, it missed the street. So we're supposed to believe that this guy got 2 out of 3 direct hits, but he missed the street. Okay? And
he was awfully nervous.
And then on top of that, there's no copper on the curb. Okay, the FBI tried to hide this for years on end. But Harold Weisberg finally went through enough FOIA suits that he got this information. Now, what does that mean, that there's no copper on the curb? Because the bullet was supposed to hit the curb, ricochet up, and hit Teg. If anybody here has ever seen WCC 6.5 bullets, they're covered in copper. They're completely, a whole coating of copper is over the top of the bullet. So how could the bullet hit that curb, go 180 degrees up without leaving a trace of copper? Okay, so that's the second magic bullet. Okay, and by the way, if you want to see something funny, you ought to read how Posner and Bugliosi try and explain this in their books. I've had the misfortune of having to read every page of those 2 books. Okay,
That's a lot.
I would not recommend this for the mental health of anybody listening to this show. Okay, or you'll be a worse person if you read those 2 books. Now, the way that Posner explains this. Now, I hope everybody who's listening is sitting down. Okay, he says the bullet hit a twig on a tree, and the twig knocked off the copper coating. Now, how he wrote that with a straight face is unbelievable. Now, what Bugliosi does, all right, he says the bullet was spinning, and as it hit the street, that rotation stripped off all the copper. Okay, and that's why there's no copper on the curb. All right, now I think anybody would say those are fantasies. Okay, they're ridiculous. Now, here's the third magic bullet. Okay, this is the one that's supposed to have struck Kennedy in the skull. All right, now to believe this, remember, the tip and the base of that bullet allegedly end up in the front seat of the car. Okay, so in other words, it's split, but it's still, both pieces still hurtled forward and landed in the front of the car. But here's the problem: there's a 6.5 millimeter fragment is still in JFK's skull. Okay, so the only logical conclusion is that the bullet split into I can't even keep a straight face saying this. The bullet split into 3 sections, and the front and the base went forward into the car, and the middle of the bullet stayed in JFK's head. Okay? Now how could the base of the bullet gravitate either above or below the middle of the bullet and proceed out the front of JFK's skull, therefore hitting it there? And how could the middle of the bullet stop so close to the exterior of JFK's skull? Because it's only like a fraction of an inch inside JFK's head. All right. So this is these are actually, if you actually take them apart and analyze them, it's not one magic bullet. It's three magic bullets. Okay. Has anybody ever in their whole life ever heard of three magic bullets in an assassination? Okay, but that's what we're forced to believe with this. All right.
Yeah. Well, so along those lines, there's, for me, there's additional questions in all of this. When you start to count up the evidence of damage and potential damage, the idea of there being just those many bullets is difficult to to understand. But I think the other part of it is the acoustical perception of people in that plaza, because of the problems with the size of the buildings and their juxtaposition to one another and so on and so forth. There's a lot of very testimony on this. And one thing I wonder, and I haven't seen a lot on this. You all probably know a lot more about this than I do, but if you count the number of potential hits around the limousine and some that missed, as you talked about, there's way more than three or four. Most people say three or four. So was there the possibility of a use of some form of silencers or other type of uh, add-ons to these guns that may have? Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's in much of the reading or the literature, or gun experts have talked about it a lot, but it seems to me like that should have been a distinct element of the research or the investigation, and not much is there on it.
Carol Hewitt, who is retired now, she used to write for Pro Magazine.
Yeah.
Okay. And she actually wrote an article about this. They were called suppressors in those days. All right. I don't know how she did it. One of the chief suspects for supplying the weapons in Dealey Plaza is a guy named Mitch Werbel. Okay. And he was a child prodigy, with ammunition and rifles, etc. I don't know how she did it, but she got a chart that Werbel had made up, okay, of what he called a directionally silenced rifle, okay? And what he did is he mapped out on this chart, if the rifle's here and the bullet's going this way, there will be a zone where people don't hear anything at all, but there will be a zone also where people hear something, but they're going to hear it as if it's coming from the other side. Okay. And so she came to the conclusion, and by the way, Jim Hogan actually wrote about this once too, very briefly. This is the pattern you get in Dealey Plaza. Okay. Which leads to suspicion. Maybe Werbel actually did, supply the weapons for the assassination. All right. So that's a very, very interesting question. But let me, to get back to the book, what Paul and I and Andrew did with our two other authors, we tried to take 10 topics, okay? And for example, Matt Crumpton wrote a very good essay on impersonations of Oswald. And in fact, that's the best essay I've actually ever read on that subject. It's the most complete and the most comprehensive that I've ever read on that. And then he concludes, could all these instances of impersonation be a coincidence? They all accidental, etc. Okay. And then Paul did one. Well, Paul did actually more than one. But he did one on the prior plots, okay, and he's been writing about this for a very long time, and he accents, how is it so possible that so many of the prior fall guys were associated with the FPCC, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, could that be an accident? And Oliver actually took a couple of these and we put it in the film, the Tampa plot and the Chicago plot. Okay. All right. And so then I wrote about CE 399. Okay, the one that's commonly called the magic bullet. And I traced the almost impossible chain of well, I think it actually is impossible, the chain of custody of CE 399. And so what we did, the concept of the book is that each one of these taken singly, okay, would be a very, very serious problem for the prosecution. Okay, if Oswald had actually stood trial, but taken together, all right, it would be almost an impossibility. I think Paul is going to say actually it would be an impossibility. Okay, to convict Oswald when you take these together. Okay, and Andrew did. And this is another thing that's unusual about the book. I've never seen this before. See, since Andrew is a lawyer up there in Canada, he did a lot of work on what is called standards of proof. Okay, there's generally accepted there's three standards. Okay, the preponderance of the evidence, clear and convincing, and beyond a reasonable doubt. I will let him talk about that. Andrew, go ahead. Tell him what you found out about the whole reasonable doubt standard.
Yeah, I've been interested in standards of proof for quite some time. So the first thing I really wanted to do is look at how the previous investigations handled applying their standards of proof to their findings and conclusions. And so I dug into the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, and while they gave lip service to standards of proof, they actually went out of their way to say, well, we're not going to apply a standard of proof to our decision-making processes. And that's right in the Warren Commission and in the House Select Committee. And so I became deeply concerned because when you're looking at evidence, when you're weighing evidence, you always apply the evidence against a standard of proof. And to not do so is a problem because it allows for completely arbitrary decision-making. And so learning that the Warren Commission said, "Oh, this is the Rock of Gibraltar of all cases, and our conclusions are solid." Yet they didn't apply any standard of proof to any of the evidence that they considered, and the same goes for the House Select Committee. I thought, okay, well, in our book at least, we should look at all of the different standards of proof and apply a high standard of proof of clear and convincing evidence to the issues of conspiracy and obstruction. And so when Matt, Paul, Jim, and Mark went through each of their chapters, when they looked at the evidence for conspiracy or obstruction of justice, they applied the high level of standard of proof of clear and convincing evidence. And then on the flip side, when it comes to Oswald's guilt, we should apply the criminal standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think the book really does a good job at looking at all of the evidence and presenting it in a way that the reader, as you like to say, Jeff, the jury, can weigh that evidence under a real standard, unlike the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee. Now, I do have to say, at each stage along the way, the government decision makers have immediately attacked the standards of proof. So they didn't even apply any in the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee. But in 2017, when the JFK Act deadline came around in October of 2017, the very first thing that happened is in a memo from the Office of Legal Counsel, Curtis Gannon. And the first thing that he did is he tried to eradicate or render inoperable Section 6 of the JFK Act, which contains the clear and convincing standard of proof. And I got to say, in the current court case in California, the same thing is happening. They are trying to get rid of the postponement standards under Section 6 and the standard of proof. So the standard of proof frames the Chokeholds book, and I think it should really frame anyone's consideration of any of the evidence in this case. So it's a central part of the book. Paul, maybe you want to comment.
Well, yeah, if I can build on what both you and Jim are saying, Jeff, the concept of the book, what stimulated it was, I would say two things. First off is about 10 years ago, I had done a study on how history books relate the Kennedy assassination, and an overwhelming number of them, and I'm talking about the textbooks, handed out to high school students, will say something along the lines that he was killed by a lone nut, Lee Harvey Oswald, and this was confirmed by the Warren Commission. I later questioned the authors through email. They all answered, over 20 books I'm talking about here. And very few, if any, knew of the existence of the subsequent investigations after the Warren Commission, including those that impeached the Warren Commission. I mean, that's unbelievable in itself. The second thing that I would say stimulated Chokeholds is last year at Kappa, I met Matt Crumpton and Mark Adamczyk for the first time. I've known Jim for 10 years now because I've been writing a lot for Kennedy's and King. And later I met Andrew, and we said, we had a discussion, and people were asking, well, what do you think of the backyard photos? What do you think of the acoustic evidence? And slowly but surely, what we were saying, well, they're interesting, they're compelling, but as far as we're concerned, they don't constitute what Malcolm Blunt would call a chokehold. And one of them asked, well, what is a chokehold? It's something that's indisputable. You can dispute the backyard photos. I mean, when you get into the shadow discussion and all that, I've looked at shadows and they're tricky. You can't convince someone, everybody, of that. So what we finally, looked at and we discussed, we said, well, these are the 10 most compelling chokeholds. And each one of them, if you conclude that Oswald was impersonated, then there's a conspiracy. If you conclude that CE 399 or the magic bullets are impossible, then there's a conspiracy. So in the book, you have 10 chokeholds. And what was great about this book is we had 3 attorneys reining us in, as well as Jim, saying, hey, wait a minute, if I brought this to a jury, how confident would I feel with this? What are your sources? You have over 700 sources in the book, and they tend to be almost entirely primary sources. In other words, not necessarily another book. It would be, here's what the FBI had to say about this, or here's witness testimony that's on video. So maybe end on this note, the word chokeholds comes from Malcolm Blunt, and he used it on maybe a more complicated chokehold, but it had to do with, Jim is well aware of this, is the Betsy Wolfe find for the HSCA. Betsy Wolfe was a House Select Committee staffer who was tasked with trying to figure out the CIA filing systems, especially as they pertain to defectors. And what came out of that research was basically 2 things, is it did not make sense that the 201 file on Oswald was opened a year late. And there was something extremely revealing in the fact that all the information on Oswald that normally would have gone to the Soviet Russia division did not. It ended up going to the Office of Security. And the reason it went to the Office of Security, according to John Newman and others, is Oswald was being used as a false defector. So that is just one element in that part there about,
But Paul, it's not just that.
Oh,
the
yeah.
Office of Security does not set up a 201 file. Okay. That's another thing that Malcolm told me. All right. See, Jim, they didn't want a 201 file on this guy set up. That's why one of the reasons it went there. Okay. Let me just add something, but Andrew because I think that's such an important part of the book. One of the things that Andrew discovered and which I've never seen in any other JFK book, okay, and that's another reason it makes this so unique, that the origination for the beyond a reasonable doubt standard comes from the fact that it's not so much for the defendant, it's to protect the community from the guilt of convicting an innocent man. Okay. And when I read that, after I first saw Andrew wrote it, I go, can you get any more perfect for the JFK case? Because ever since the Warren Commission has been exposed, our country has been plagued by this doubt, okay, this disbelief, this cynicism about government. and and according to polls, it started in 1964 when the Warren Commission report was first issued. So that's another real gem that Andrew dug up, that I think makes for a really important contribution and makes the book unique.
If I can just say something to that, Jim. Yeah, I found this book called Origins of Reasonable Doubt. And so I've given credit in the book to that piece of work. But it went even a little bit further, which I think it really does apply to the JFK case. It back in the old days, the really old days, it was considered a mortal sin to wrongfully convict someone. And so there are religious underpinnings to this whole beyond a reasonable doubt standard of proof. And so the court system or judicial system ended up adopting this beyond a reasonable doubt in order to protect the souls of jury members. So just in case they did wrongfully convict someone, they wouldn't be damned to hell for doing so. And it just, when it comes to the JFK case, I God help those people who convicted Oswald in the public opinion on such flimsy evidence.
That's a good way of putting it.
You all are probably like me. I have something like 250 or 300 books on this topic and thousands of videos and lots of other published information as resources when I write the episodes. They range in readability, the crispness of the prose, the clarity of what you get inside of those books. Your basic ability to comprehend and understand what their point is, because sometimes there is no point in some of them. And I will say that this was an incredibly refreshing read for me. The construct of the book is such that you use executive summaries. I come from the business world. I love that. I can listen to somebody for 10 or 15 minutes and you're not sure what they're telling you. And you're sort of like, what's your point? Well, you start out with the point. The point is right there. It's very clear to the reader. And then you proceed to lay out your case associated with it. It's a very logical construct to the book. And I think it makes it very readable and very comprehensible. So, and the other part, which, and you all are demonstrating this by the richness of this conversation, the depth of your understanding. I mean, you're the premier, part of the premier research set in the country, in the world that looks and continues to seek the truth about this topic. And what I find on the podcast is that there's a casual understanding of this by a lot of people. There's a complete lack of in-depth understanding of it by most, although the podcast attracts people who have a fair amount of knowledge actually accumulated for the most part, usually over a long period of time, particularly people in my generation that may have seen things first on the movie JFK, so on and so forth. So, what I love about the book is you can read it and you can be sort of a beginner or at any stage of your matriculation on the topic, and really get something new out of it. Maybe a lot new if you're relatively new to the game. And that's the wonderful thing about it, because it's a common denominator type of book. I think it's going to bring a lot of people together with a common understanding of these really important topics you've just talked about.
Well, Jeff, if I may chime in, you're absolutely right. It was top of mind, I think, for the authors. How can we make this easy to digest for beginners as well, and meaningful for people who've researched for a long time? Look, I've done an awful lot of book reviews, and there are so many names of characters. So if you look at the typical index, I'm sure it's 5 times longer than what you'll find in any book. So trying to just keep up with the names, and you have Italian names in there, you have German names, you have Cuban exile names. So it's just, you know that when you watch a TV show, you have trouble keeping up with 6 characters. How are you going to do it with hundreds? And I actually teach business to students, and that's the first thing we teach them, is that if you want to get the reader or the bosses or the person interviewing his attention, you have to be able to have an executive summary. And if you have an executive summary where within 1 page you say, okay, I get the gist of it, well, the person will be able to have that as, sort of a benchmark for reading the next 20 pages and saying, okay, yeah, he mentioned that. I see why he brought this up in the executive summary. So yeah, I think that was really important in the construct, and sticking to a formula. And at the end of every chapter, what you had is sort of a summation that a lawyer would make, and saying, therefore, ergo, because of this, and that, he could not have been on the 6th floor. Or because of this, how many people do you know that were impersonated at least 17 times, that were 23-year-olds? So it's a logical construct. And if you may argue with one of the chokeholds, 2, 4, maybe 7, but there are 3 that you agree with, you have a conspiracy.
See, one of the things the book opens up with is the dissidents who were in on the official investigations. Okay, like for instance, most people think, and this was the propaganda line put out, was that the Warren Commission was unanimous in their opinion. Well, that isn't true. All right, and in fact, the Warren Commission was in fact a minority report. All right, it should be called the Dulles McCloy Commission. Okay, that's what it really should be called. All right, because as we put in there, as we elucidated, you had Richard Russell, John Sherman Cooper, Hale Boggs, and Jerry Ford, who all disagreed, okay, with the verdict of the Warren Commission. So that's 4. Okay, so it was really 4-3 the other way. And if you ask me, I don't believe Warren actually believed it either. Okay, but he was so intimidated by Johnson that he went along with it. All right, so then we go to people like on the church committee, like Gary Hart and Richard Schweiker. All right, who did an investigation of what did the FBI really sell the Warren Commission on? Okay, and it wasn't very good. Okay, so then we go to the HSCA with people like Gayton Fonzie and Danny Hardaway, okay, and Eddie Lopez and Bob Tannenbaum, okay, and Richard Sprague. All right, and today even Robert Blakey, okay, believes that there was a front shot. All right. And so that's one of the ways we arrange. Paul gets to the point how can these history textbooks ignore all of these people involved in these official investigations who disagreed with the final product? All right, and I believe that ties in with what Andrew's writing about why here we are in 2024. Let me say that again. 2024. JFK was killed in 1963. All right. Why are there still 4,000 documents being withheld? Okay. In the face of going on 61 years now of the public clamoring for everything to be finally released to the public. Why is this so? It's completely inexplicable to me.
Well, Jim, let me. This is a great segue, I think, as we had a couple of questions that we talked about in advance, and I'm really interested in your all your views on these next couple of questions. Obviously, you've asked probably the seminal question of what was the scale of it, if it was to hide or protect people who were living. The vast majority of those individuals are now deceased, so that isn't the issue. The issue of sources and methods is a weak one, we know, and I think that the general public's question is: was it something much bigger? Was there more involved here? Potentially with other governments. Was there the real potential for war as Johnson purported in his discussions, for instance, with Earl Warren, those kind of things. If there ever was a connection to the Cubans or the Russians, that it would have been explosive in that moment in time. Would have probably been today too, as well, but certainly then during the height of the Cold War. So, how do you interpret all of that? Is there some evidence that points to or leads to a deeper connection that has yet to be unraveled? You talk in the book actually about two things which I think are fascinating: the interactions with French intelligence between Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy family, and also the lesser known story, which has been out there for some time, but the whole discussion around the Russians, who clearly knew as communists they were likely to be pinned with this, and did their own investigations and came to the conclusion that it was a right-wing conspiracy, that in fact LBJ had something more to do with, and that it was potentially a coup. So with all that as the backdrop, talk, if you can, a little bit about these really sort of seminal topics around that whole matter.
Well, if you want, I can go first. I think the whole World War III scenario was more something to get people to play ball and to line themselves up with, let's not dig any further than we have to. I don't really believe that. I think quickly a lot of the people who were organizing the commission found out that at a minimum, there were so many embarrassing relationships between Oswald and the FBI, Oswald and the CIA. There was way more to Oswald, and it had nothing to do with him being in cahoots with Castro. What he did in Russia and what he did for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee were missions. They were intelligence missions, not for Castro. They were for internal reasons. Whether just the fact that you would be tied to this fellow or connected to this fellow, so you could have an excuse there saying, hey, look, this is too explosive. We can't explain this. He was an informant, and yet not necessarily have something to do with the assassination. So there was every reason in the world, to keep this whole thing secret, including possible involvement of, persons of extreme interest that we always discuss. So pertaining to the French, Russians, and Cubans, We know they had an awful lot of intelligence in the US, especially around New Orleans. And the reason being that there were attempts on the gold slave, and there were links with New Orleans. And one of the New Orleans links has to do with a guy called Maurice Gatlin, who, brought money and helped finance. And he was out of New Orleans. And then you had, of course, Permindex that kind of links to, Clay Shaw, who's in there. So there were reasons to, to spy. And of course, the Cubans had, a huge number of informants within the Cuban exile community. And the thing with the Russians is they didn't use their findings or their knowledge to provoke the Americans. They kept it mostly for internal consumption. So they didn't go around saying, hey, you murdered your own president. You guys are not a democracy. Lately, Putin has been, maybe waving that around, but that wasn't done back then. So that's my view on it. I think that this whole foreign government thing has always been overplayed, and but that they knew something much bigger was involved for sure.
That's a variant. Let's put it this way. Within 5 days of the assassination, Castro did a long speech in which he explained how the whole thing really happened, and it wasn't the official story. He was supposed to give, I think, a speech to some students at some college on economics, but he said, I think it's more important to talk about what just happened in the United States. And he went ahead and in a remarkable speech, he laid out the whole thing. Come on, this Oswald guy asked to be interviewed by the FBI, okay, in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. He just happens to be associating with all these Cuban exiles, etc. All right, so that's one. Then there's de Gaulle. De Gaulle, who was the target of numerous assassination plots in France, okay, said, look, you can't pull something like that off unless there's some people on the inside, okay, depriving you of the proper protection. All right. And then there's Khrushchev. Khrushchev met with Drew Pearson, I believe, in the spring of 1964 in Egypt. Okay. He happened to be visiting there, and Pearson was an FBI informant. Okay. And he wrote this report saying, inevitably, we talked about the Kennedy assassination. I tried to push the whole Oswald did it thing on him, and he started laughing. And he says, you really don't expect me to believe that, do you? Okay, so here you have, de Gaulle, Khrushchev, and Castro all not taking what everybody in the United States is supposed to take seriously. They all think it's a fairy tale, and they're right. Okay.
Yeah. It's a great segue, actually, because you mentioned something in the middle of that, Jim, that is sort of very fresh in the minds of the listeners at JFK, the Enduring Secret. And that's the issue of the involvement of the Secret Service and the protection and the matters that occurred around the plots and the alleged plots and the period just prior to the assassination. You mentioned a few of them in the earlier part of the conversation, but going all the way back to Springfield, the Washington plots, Chicago, and then of course, Miami and Tampa with the Joseph Miltier tape and the whole Don Adams story that goes around that as well too later, and William Somerset. Tell us a little bit, because the book does a great job, I think, in laying that out. And the one thing that the deep dive into the Secret Service episodes should reveal to everybody listening is that when you listen to it, you ping pong back and forth between an incredible level of incompetence, a little bit of laziness, and at times, a circumstance where you have to evaluate whether something was deliberate and perhaps nefarious. And it isn't really, for me, as bad as some of it is, completely clear until you get to the discussion around the prior plots. And when you see what they were dealing with in Miami and Tampa, particularly, and what they already knew just days before, and how they still, in the face of that, altered how the basic protections of the president in quite similar circumstances just a few days later. It's very hard forensically to be at the 10,000 foot level and look at that and have anybody explain that away in some innocuous fashion. And so you all obviously addressed that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well,
Because I think
Paul. In fact, I think it might be. I think Paul had the longest segment in JFK Revisited because Oliver was really interested in that. Okay, and Paul did a very nice job. Well, Gilberto Lopez. Go ahead, Paul. Talk about Gilberto Lopez.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And good point, Jeff. Just as a template, as a background, the reason the prior plots, it really should be called similar case analysis, because there's certain things that we talk about in there that aren't necessarily plots, but are cases that any investigator would have looked into and said, hey, you know what, there's a guiding hand here. There's a template. Jim brought up earlier the number of potential patsies that are linked to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Now, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, for all practical purposes, was dead in 1963. It was on its, they weren't having meetings anymore. They even, they had some board meetings, the Socialist Workers' Party, to say, we'll keep it alive on paper, So in the meantime, you have Oswald opening up and making a fool out of himself in the most dangerous city in the world to be able to, start leafleting for communists. Yeah. The other point that you bring up, Jeff, is if you talk about Springfield and you talk about Miltyr and you talk about Tampa, these are threats of assassination from high buildings. Okay, yeah, and where's he assassinated from? A high building. It wasn't as if there wasn't an advance warning. Now, the third thing before I get to Tampa is Tim Samalok of the Warren Commission in Jim's documentary. I found it amazing when he talked about how the Secret Service in 1993 went into shredding mode of all JFK's travels in 1993. Why? Because probably we would have seen in those files, personalities and people that are involved and say, boy, are these Cuban exiles? Are these people linked with the FPCC? So they didn't want us to dig into that stuff. Now, getting to Tampa. Tampa is an extremely interesting one because it's the HSCA itself that says the fact that the FBI did not look into this guy called Policarpo Lopez, okay, and they didn't investigate him for the Warren Commission, was egregious. Why? Because here was a suspect who was acting very suspiciously. He, shortly after the assassination, went to Mexico City, according to their files, through Laredo, and was a lone passenger on a plane to Cuba. And that was after having made threats to kill, threats to, or being linked to even Oswald. So he's not investigated. And then when you look into him, guess what he did a few days and a few weeks leading up to the assassination? He was attending Fair Play for Cuba Committee meetings. So I think if you put all that chapter together and you look into it, there's another one I'll just mention briefly. Is shortly after the assassination, the police in San Francisco arrested an ex-military guy who was making threats against Johnson. And this guy was part of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in San Francisco. So when you look at that, the fact that they didn't even do any similar case analysis is amazing. But just what we can dig up from the official files and from articles and everything, people like you, me, and you look at that and you say, hey, wait a minute. There are some fingerprints there, obvious fingerprints.
Let me add about the Gilberto Lopez thing. That was, I'm not sure if it was the longest, but it was one of the longest processions of any trip that Kennedy took. All right. It was literally miles upon miles upon miles. All right. And it ended up at a tall building, the Floridian Hotel. Now, this was after Chicago. All right. All right. This was after Chicago. Kennedy had canceled Chicago, probably due to the warnings coming out of there. He was determined to go through with the Tampa one. All right. And he made sure that there were layers upon layers upon layers of protection, not just from the Secret Service, but from the state police and the local police. Mm-hmm. They were literally on every floor of the Floridian Hotel. Okay. And after it was over, Kennedy stayed there and he insisted on shaking hands with every single person that was involved with protecting him on that trip. Okay. Now here's my question. How could that have gone off like that? But a few days later in Dallas, you get the famous movie of Don Lawton being called off the car as it's coming out of left field, and he's moving his hands up and down. What are we doing? What are we doing? Lawton would have been on the back bumper of the car. Okay, there's special rubber bumpers that the Secret Service puts on the limousine. That's where he would have been, obstructing a rear shot. All right, so everybody in the world who's listening to this show has every right to ask that question. Okay, what was the difference between Tampa and Dallas? Now, remember, it's not just Tampa though, because Chicago took place 3 weeks prior. So you would figure that any protective service agent, okay, in the Secret Service would say, wait a minute, here we've got this guy, this valet guy, okay, in Chicago. We've got this Gilberto Lopez guy who's going to Fair Play for Cuba Committee meetings in Tampa. And then he runs away and he goes to Texas, goes to Mexico City. Don't you think we ought to be careful about what's going on in Dallas because they despise Kennedy down there? You would think that would be the natural reaction. And instead of stripping the protection away, you'd think they'd be adding the protection to it.
Well, as you know, there were really clear indications and the destruction of records related to all those previous trips, right as the ARRB requested them, is another serious point of confusion.
And let me add this. The Secret Service knew that was something that the review board was targeting. They had sent a letter to the Secret Service a few days before, okay? And so they knew they wanted those records. They disappeared them anyway.
Yeah.
And in fact, as Doug Horn mentions in his book, Inside the ARB, there was a debate inside the review board. Should we take these guys to the mat on this to discourage anybody else from doing this? They were seriously thinking of calling a press conference and screaming bloody murder at the Secret Service for doing this. They ended up not doing. I think they should have done it.
Well, they ended up they sent I think what they did, and the sort of the go to the mat thing was simply to send a second letter. I think Jeremy Gunn sent the first one, and then Tunheim sent actually a letter as the head of that review board, and that was as far as they took it. And
yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a real problem with with that. But to that point, and I asked this a lot in the
Jeff, can I just add one last thing?
Oh, yes, sure, sure.
Okay. If you take a look at the Zapruder film, where are the motorcycles? Where are the motorcycles? Forrest Sorrells stripped away a couple of the motorcycles. Okay. They're supposed to be bracketing the car. Well, go ahead and look at the Zapruder film. See if they're bracketing the car.
Yeah.
Okay. They're not bracketing the car.
Well,
and the fact that they're not bracketing a car allows a front shot from the grassy knoll to get at Kennedy. So if you take Lawton off the back and you take away the bracketing, well, come on, you're like at a target range.
Well, and I think, yeah, and let's add to that. If you're sort of a Doug Weldon disciple, and you're presuming that there absolutely was a shot from the front, and they removed what would normally have been a person sitting in the middle front seat in order to remove the obscurity of that shot. And I think it was at General McHugh would have been normally sitting in that seat. Or Berkeley. I think either one of them were at times in the front seat, and they
were moved to the back.
They were. Yeah, exactly. So you have a circumstance where the shot was cleared out. The path for that shot was cleared out. So there's and again, I think that I'd love to see you all do this. We're about ready to do the summation on the Secret Service issues, and that'll be in a separate episode as soon as we finish up some of the plots. And I would love to see you all do a Chokeholds on the Secret Service. It's really, for me, it's crazy. I think that body of evidence is an example of the stand down of the Praetorian Guard, and the real question is who ordered it and how, and
why did they turn down the offer from the San Antonio? Why did they turn down that offer? That's very, very weird. But getting back to the book, I believe Paul is the first, and I believe the only guy, to actually do what is called in the trade a comparative case analysis. If you can believe it, the Warren Commission completely missed the Chicago plot. Okay. All right. And then the HSCA discounted it. They mentioned Gilberto Lopez, but they still didn't do any prior comparative case analysis. I believe Paul is the first guy to do this kind of thing. Okay. Like all the things that happened that should have been an absolute red arrow to Dallas. Like I've said before, if you consider Paul's analysis, I think the inevitable conclusion is this: Kennedy was not getting out of 1963 alive. And that's what happened. Okay.
Well, let's ask a question around that too, because I think, Don Adams, who was the FBI agent down in Valdosta and Quitman in that area, eventually wrote a book. And it's a stunning book about what happened to the evidence down there related to the investigation of Joseph Miltier. And it's an incredible story. There's more to Miltier, obviously, than meets the eye, because he was a sort of a lower mid-level courier in a lot of ways on a lot of different things. But if you lived in the South at that time, you really have a better appreciation of just what was there, just what sympathies were, clearly embodied in a lot of different institutional elements, including the law enforcement agencies. And I'm sure it was in the FBI at that moment, and particularly in places like Atlanta. I happen to live, part-time in Atlanta now too. So, I've grown up in the South, even though I was born in the North, and you really get a flavor. The country's changed a lot in 70 years, but for those of us who are old enough, I guess I'll say it as bluntly as this: you've seen some of those things from Mississippi burning. I remember, I'll tell you, this is burned in my head. I mentioned it. The episode's not out yet, but it's recorded. It's about some of these things. I remember I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I was growing up in Fort Lauderdale. We were playing football, the kids in the neighborhood, and it was just about dusk. And I looked down. We stopped for a minute. Something caught our eye. We looked down to the end of the street, quite a ways down. And there, roaring on fire, was a cross about 12 or 14 feet high. And it had been placed in the front yard of someone who had just moved into a house in the neighborhood. It was the first African American family that was in the neighborhood. We were too young. We were all too young to really understand what it was, but it was an absolutely frightening experience to look down there and to see that. And it was confusing because no one really knew why this was occurring. And even in some of the more metropolitan areas, and of course, places like South Florida, quickly evolved into much more diverse and international places. But there was still an element of the Deep South, even in places like that, in the late '60s and early '70s. And I don't think people realize just what was underneath the covers and a lot of the different fabric of life. And so I mean, these are his story is absolutely amazing. He was one of these guys who
well, can I comment on that, Jeff?
Yeah, sure.
See, look, Eisenhower and Nixon made a conscious decision not to abide by the Brown versus Board decision. Okay? The Brown versus Board decision was epical because I'm sure Andrew's very familiar with. Very seldom does a court reverse itself. Okay? Andrew, what is that called? Stare decisis?
Yeah, once there's a legal precedent, lower courts cannot go against that decision.
Right. So Plessy versus Ferguson set a precedent. Okay, it could only be reversed by another Supreme Court decision. All right, and so then in 1954 you had Brown versus Board, but Eisenhower and Nixon decided they weren't going to strictly enforce it. In fact, they barely enforced it at all. In 1957, Kennedy made a speech in New York City, and he said, we must abide by the Brown versus Board decision. It's the law of the land. But then even worse, he went to Jackson, Mississippi, and he said the same thing. Okay, we will abide by the Brown versus Board decision. Now, in case your listeners don't know what that means, it means that public facilities must be integrated, especially schools. Okay, in the South, you had this rigorous segregation. Okay, and so here's Kennedy in 1957 saying twice that we're going to abide by the Brown versus Board decision. And so then in 1961, Bobby Kennedy goes to the University of Georgia Law School. He takes an hour-long speech, and about 1/3 of that speech, he says, we're going to abide by the Brown versus Board decision. All right. Now you can imagine all these right-wing groups in the South, how they felt when they heard this, okay, that this was not going to be Eisenhower and Nixon anymore, but we are going to go ahead and proceed on the basis that the Brown versus Board decision is the law of the land, okay? You had all of these wild right-wing groups, States' Rights Party, the Minutemen, etc., okay? And not only did they say it, but they proceeded to do it, all right? Especially University of Mississippi with Edwin Walker causing a riot there. And then at the University of Alabama, okay, where Kennedy brought 3,000 men in, to back up the state police, back up the state National Guard, okay? Yeah. And you had to face off with George Wallace on television. If you weren't there, you don't understand what this was like. because that thing with Wallace, that was on all three networks. Everybody in the country was watching television, was tuned in and saw this thing. Okay. And they saw the military deployments on both sides. Okay. And they saw that Kennedy had nationalized the state guard. And the state guard general goes up and says, "You're either moving or we're going to have to remove you." Okay. All right. So the tension, you could cut it with a knife. And then that night, at the suggestion of his brother, JFK makes that epical civil rights speech. Okay. Which nobody ever heard anything like that from a president. You have to go back to Lincoln, to get anything like what he did on national television. The country will never be free until all of its citizens are free. So you can imagine the way somebody like Joseph Miltier felt about this guy, after he does this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing set of stories. I think, you know what, I'm just looking at the time, guys. We're getting on to about an hour. And we can go on for longer if you have time. But I do have
Jeff, I've got NBC calling me. Okay.
You probably do. That's the thing.
No.
You got Oliver Stone or somebody calling.
No, Andrew might have CBC, but I don't have NBC.
All good. You never know. Matt maybe, because he's been on these things lately. He did his work with Paramount Plus. I mean, there's been a lot of exposure you all have had collectively. Andrew,
we're very appreciative for you doing this, Jeff.
Well, the feeling is mutual. It's I would say it's a research love fest here. I will tell you, one of the things which you said in the book, and I want to ask Andrew a sort of a final question. He's been pretty quiet here. He's chirping in occasionally, but before I get to that, I want to say, that your book is one that I hope everybody will go out and get and put on their shelves after they've read it, not put on the shelves and not read it. A lot of people buy these books and they never get through them. I bought your book, and I didn't do it on day one. I got busy. And then all of a sudden, Andrew texted me and it reminded me, and I went out and bought it. When I got it, I couldn't put it down. It's a great book. It's really readable. It'll advance the whole thing. And you have a concept in there that I want to get to. And you mentioned it earlier, in 1963, it was almost unfathomable that there could have been a coup in this country, or there could have been something of the nature that we dealt with in this event. And everyone who was smart enough in the very early beginning to probe this in an appropriate fashion and began to see all of the problems. Many of them faced incredible odds at trying to get to the truth, and in the beginning there was danger, true danger. And I think most of that has subsided in today's environment in terms of the danger element of it. And what has amazingly happened in the last 20 years, I think, with the internet age and some level of consciousness of the American public, and so much has gone on in other events, that the believability of what was once an extraordinary set of premises is no longer something that people look at and say, boy, it's so far out, we don't understand it, we can't believe it. Your approach to this, I think the sentence was something like, we want to set out to remove some of the quackery around these topics. And look, there's a lot of intellectual firepower in this room right now, and there'd be even more if all five of you were here. The caliber of individuals that are involved in your project is really second to none. And I think it brings a tremendous amount of credibility to it. It's not, this is not a short, and I'm not going to name anybody, but I've seen some things lately where I'm there's a big lead up and a little bit of a disappointment on because I don't think it is as well researched as something like Chokeholds. So I just want to congratulate all of you. It's an amazing book. I'm sure it won't be the last from all of you, for sure. And I'm going a little bit out of order, but I want to stop there. I want to ask Andrew one question. Andrew, there's a lot of I get many emails, and there's a lot of questions about whether all that's gone on in the last year or two to try to pry the rest of the records loose has been helpful or hurtful or neutral. And I don't think there's anybody better than you that could answer this question. Do you think there is still a path forward to release the remaining records which are still in the custody of the government? And I know that's a conjecture on your part, and I don't want you to reveal anything that would impinge upon the strategy of that occurring. But I think we're in the sunset period of this. There's a few key witnesses left. Marina Oswald, there's a few, not many. And there's not many people we can ask now about these things. But before it's really too late to ask anyone anything, do you think we'll get the rest of these records?
I can't really answer that in a yes or no way. I think after Oliver Stone's JFK film came out, there was just a massive groundswell of public outrage about the secrecy over those files. The conspiracy was one thing to commit the murder, but the government's withholding of its own records from its people was so grievously unjustified to the American people that they spoke out en masse. And that resulted in the creation of the Assassinations Record Review Board, which came out of the JFK Records Act in 1992. I think what we've seen, Jeff, in 2017, first off, when President Trump did his first major postponement in October, the public reaction was like, hey, all those records were supposed to be released in October 2017. And there were quite a few, mainly researchers and some members of the public were, hey, wait a second, we were supposed to get those records. Then there were several subsequent postponements in 2018, and when President Biden became president in 2021. This last postponement last June really sparked outrage, and you could even feel it in the mainstream media, which have been really quite horrible in reporting on the JFK assassination and the withholding of all these records. There was a palpable change of reporting on the JFK records in June of 2023 with President Biden's last postponement. There's no explanation. A specific law was created to release those records, thousands of them, and that's records. That's not pages, that's records. Some pages are upwards of 200 or 300 pages. So we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially still millions of pages of records that are being kept, in my view, unlawfully by the government with respect to the assassination. So do I think there's a good likelihood that they're going to be released without more public outcry, without the public contacting their congresspeople and their senators and demanding that something be done, that the JFK Records Act actually be followed, maybe amended to make it even more clear than the law already is that those records ought to have been released? I think really it's in the public's hands right now to put that kind of pressure on their government to do what the law requires, and that's to release all of the records that remain in the withheld collection. And that's the only way I think it's going to happen.
Thank you. That's a great PS for the audience, I think, at the end, because there's more to do here and more ground to cover. Gentlemen, I'll give you any last word you like. I have to say, Paul, wonderful to meet you for the first time today.
Thank you.
Absolutely amazing. Jim, I can't wait to have you back, and all of you back, actually. And Andrew is coming soon too, I think, to do something more on the records in more detail. All of you have an open invitation. It's really an honor to have you all on the show, and I can't wait to get it published.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jeff. You know what? It's always a pleasure, and you've been wonderful in providing the episodes that you have over the last 3 years. And I'm really happy for your success and to play whatever little small part that we have. And on behalf of all of the authors of the Chokeholds, we really do thank you for having us on.
Yes, I agree with my colleagues, and I want to thank my colleagues too, because the Chokeholds would not have reached the caliber it did without a group effort. Andrew didn't talk too much today. He did, I think, make some very good, give insights, but what the attorneys did and what Jim did to ensure quality control at all times, and that permeated through every chapter. It was huge for us. So thank you to my colleagues, and nice meeting you, Jeff. I think you have a wonderful approach with your guests, and be happy to be back on.
Wonderful. Well, good day, gentlemen. Enjoy the weekend, and I can't wait to have you back.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you for watching our inaugural episode of JFK the Enduring Secret on YouTube. And be sure to find our podcast on any popular podcast outlet.